Prime Minister Theresa May has announced a full inquiry into how contaminated blood transfusions infected thousands of people with hepatitis C and HIV in the 70s and 80s. It's said to have been a factor in over 2,400 deaths so far. Last Friday, 6 party leaders at Westminster wrote to Mrs May calling for a Hillsborough-style inquiry, saying this is one of the worst peacetime disasters in our country's history. The contaminated blood was given to haemophiliacs and other patients needing blood transfusions in the 70s and 80s. The UK had imported supplies of a clotting agent called Factor 8, some of which turned out to be infected. Much of the plasma used to make it came from donors, including prison inmates in the United States who sold their blood. And they were, of course, more likely to have lived the kind of lives which caused their blood to be unclean. In 2015, David Cameron apologised, but survivors felt that didn't go far enough. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has long campaigned for an inquiry and for the full truth to come out.
There has been evidence here of falsification of people's medical records, tests being done without people's knowledge or consent, and then the results of those tests, even when they confirmed a positive diagnosis of hepatitis C or HIV, not being communicated to the individuals affected, and then subsequently, in some cases, their partners being infected. That's the depth of this cover-up. So I have an example of a case where a very senior gentleman who worked with the government as a civil servant had his medical notes amended to suggest that he was a lifetime alcoholic, to suggest that his liver damage was his own responsibility. His widow has told me directly that that was pure falsification of his notes to make it look like he was to blame and not clinical negligence.
Yesterday, an inquiry was finally announced by Theresa May, and we're going to speak to some of the people who've been affected this afternoon. So we've got Steve Dymond in the studio, who was a haemophiliac, and Steve, you were infected with hepatitis C in the 70s.
That's right, yes.
Just tell us the circumstances of that then.
Well, as a haemophiliac, you need treatment to help your blood clot. And so this could be for quite serious surgery, or it could be for sort of quite minor procedures like dental work. So I had a number of treatments in the late 70s and early 80s, and I couldn't tell you which ones were contaminated. But obviously, in amongst those treatments, they were contaminated with hepatitis C and also HIV. I know I was exposed to HIV, but fortunately that didn't go on to progress to HIV/AIDS.
Right. Now, I gather you had at some point in the 70s a bad bruise on your thumb, and that's one of the areas of suspicion, is it?
That's right. It's the mid-80s, in fact.
Mid-80s, right. Just tell us about that incident.
Well, what happened was I just sort of, like all clumsy people, just sort of knocked myself when I was doing a bit of gardening. And to err on the side of precaution, we went to the local A&E, which wasn't a haemophilia centre, and they decided to treat it with Factor 8. Now, the Factor 8 they had was, in fact, Factor 8 they knew, or almost certainly knew, was contaminated because it hadn't been heat treated. And it was on the shelf, probably for economic reasons, to use in case of perhaps a major traffic accident or, sort of a life-threatening situation for a haemophiliac, which obviously wasn't my case. And so they decided anyway to use it. And my haemophilia centre the next day said they should not have done that.
Is your wife with you today?
She is, yes.
Sue, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
So tell us this from your side. Obviously no awareness at the time that these products were tainted.
Well, we did know. We had actually read that the heat treating had made the products safe. We didn't know about the other viruses. We knew about the HIV risk. But from our understanding of the protocol at the time, the products were now safe because of the HIV treating, and part of what went wrong for us was that they were using old stock, as Steve says, that was there apparently for use in emergencies. So the treatment was right outside the guidelines. But no, we got no information at all about the hepatitis infections. We never had a diagnosis from the UK health authorities of Steve's hepatitis C status. And we weren't actually given any support at all during the 18-month wait for the HIV testing, because that was the wait at the time, or subsequently. So
Wow, that's just terrible, isn't it? And just explain then, if you can, because I know you were infected then with hepatitis C, Steve. But
Yes.
but from your perspective, Sue, what did you see happen to your husband? Because obviously he didn't know that he'd been infected.
Well, first of all, the first shock was that he'd been exposed to the risk of HIV, and then I literally watched him die inside. He closed himself off from me, and it was many, many years before we got back to the closeness we'd always had. After he got the all clear regarding the HIV, things just got worse and worse. And initially, I thought it was some sort of psychological emotional reaction, what people would call PTSD these days. Then, because of issues in his family, because of the haemophilia, I assumed it was depression, so he sought psychiatric help. And unfortunately, the medication that was used eventually, because the talking therapy wasn't working, compounded the illness. He went from being bright, academic, funny, to being very slow, very sluggish, very angry. And I can actually remember looking at him sleeping one day thinking, I don't know you anymore.
How sad. And Steve, this was actually physiological. This was to do with the illness of hepatitis.
That's right, exactly right.
And what was it doing inside your body then?
What it was doing inside my body, hepatitis C is called the silent killer for very good reason, and it essentially destroys your ability to concentrate. It induces a remarkably crushing physical fatigue, where everything seems to be, really just out of reach, far too much effort to achieve. It also destroys the liver. I've got advanced cirrhosis of the liver. I've had a liver cancer treated successfully, but I've been led to understand that if cancer comes back again, then I will need a transplant with all the risks and uncertainty that would entail. I've had internal bleeding, and quite ironically, although I've cleared hepatitis C using the new course of antiviral treatments, that's provoked severe hearing loss.
Oh, so you can now take a treatment that will clear the infection?
Yeah, there are treatments. They've been available in this country, but in the last 18 months. And I took the course of treatment, and I have cleared hepatitis C.
Well, that's great.
And I can feel, may seem a bit strange to say that, but I can feel the difference of having cleared hepatitis C.
But you've got this hearing loss, and you've not really had a clear day since the whole thing started, have you? It sounds like. Yeah.
No.
So are you feeling, Steve, that this inquiry will do something to improve your situation, or is it just too late?
I hope it will. I hope it will bring answers. I hope it will bring some sort of way of indicating who was responsible, how this appalling situation was allowed to happen, and who allowed it to happen. That will imply, obviously, officials in the Department of Health, some politicians, a great number of medical experts, and trying to tie all that together is obviously going to be quite a complicated task, but I think it needs to be done because so many people have lived with so much uncertainty, and also have sort of lost any sense of sort of dignity because of the way they've been treated by successive governments.
Thank you both so much. Steve Dymond and his wife Sue Gorman. Steve, haemophiliac, who was infected with hepatitis C, not thankfully HIV, in the 70s, and the battle still goes on. We'll get a few more of the facts from an MP who's been campaigning on this for years. Diana Johnston is the Labour MP for Hull North, and you've campaigned for an inquiry for a long time, Diana.
Yes, I first was alerted to this in 2010 when my constituent Glenn Wilkinson came to my surgery and told me about what had happened to him, and then I discovered that Glenn was one person, but there were thousands of people who'd been affected by either receiving contaminated blood products or had been infected by their partner who didn't know that they had hepatitis hepatitis C or HIV. So there are thousands of people and families that have been affected by this.
And it's not so much about blood transfusions, but about this thing called factor VIII, isn't it?
Yes, there's two parts to this. One, the big part really is the people who were haemophiliacs who received these blood products as part of keeping them apparently healthy. But there are a group of people who did receive blood transfusions, through childbirth or having dental surgery, who were infected with HIV and hepatitis C. But the big group is the haemophiliacs.
And the factor VIII, or the blood that was used, came a lot of it from American prisoners.
Yes.
And that practice went back to the 70s, is that right?
That's right, yes.
But it only became an issue once HIV and hepatitis C got into that supply.
Well, I think that's debatable, because I think there were concerns being raised in the 70s and certainly in the early 80s. And of course, I'm sure you'll remember there was that big campaign about HIV and AIDS that the government ran, and they were giving advice to people about that in 1983. And yet the health secretary, or the health minister then, said actually there's no evidence that HIV is transmitted through blood. And actually that's not what his department were telling people when they were talking about giving blood. So, I think there's some real questions for an inquiry to get to grips with about who knew what and when.
It seems very odd, doesn't it, that we were being told that advertising campaign was in 86, but obviously it was a massive story from about 1982, 83,
yes.
AIDS and HIV, and the idea no one made the connection that it might be in blood that had been given for transfusion seems just incredible.
It does, and when you think, as you said, a lot of this blood came from prisoners in the US, or prostitutes or drug users, people who had a financial incentive to lie if they had infections already, but they were willing to sell their blood, and no one was actually thinking we must look at this very carefully. I think in Scotland they took a slightly different view, and so I think they were alerted to this much earlier. But I do think, again, this is where the inquiry is really needed to find out what happened.
There have been inquiries in other countries. It seems that in a lot of countries, governments were very slow to realise the dangers of blood transfusions. So Canada, France, Iran, Iraq, Ireland, Italy, Japan. 1,400 victims in Japan, 100 in Portugal.
But the key thing there is that in Japan, we know that there have been prosecutions of company directors who were involved in selling blood. And in France, we know that a health minister was convicted of manslaughter for his role in the policy direction that the blood transfusion service took in France. So other countries have been much quicker, in a way, at actually having an investigation and finding out, who is liable and whether there's criminal actions that have taken place. We've never had that in this country, so I'm hoping that part of this inquiry will be to see, are there criminal acts that were committed? And if there were criminal acts, that people will be prosecuted.
Was there not a public inquiry led by Lord Archer of Sandwell, or was that a separate thing?
No, that wasn't a public inquiry. It was a privately funded inquiry. It didn't have the powers to compel people to come and give evidence or for documents to be produced. And that's why it's so important that we get this government-backed public inquiry with all the powers that it can compel people to give evidence and appear before it.
Thank you very much indeed, Diana Johnson, Labour MP for Hull North, who's campaigned for a long time for an inquiry which has now happened into contaminated blood, which has affected so many people and killed maybe 2,000, 3,000. Philip Wheeler in London, you are a haemophiliac, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, yep.
And you were being treated and got some infected blood?
I was, Jeremy. Yeah. So I was contaminated in the early 80s. I was a child. I was 8 or 9 years old, I think, when I was discovered that I had hepatitis C, which obviously I was treated at Great Ormond Street Hospital at the time, and they told me, I think, obviously there was no way that I could have been drinking or had a bad lifestyle to give me that. I think at that age, the very sad thing was that I think, as you pointed out, those other countries, many, many years ago, we saw those other countries, Ireland and France, actually hold their hands up and actually take some responsibility for what they'd done. I think they admitted that, the mistakes had come through them, and their victims were compensated. I've almost given, this is the first time I've really sort of spoken out about this, but we almost sort of gave up. There's been a few whispers. You mentioned Archer a few years back, and we always thought that something was going to come of it, and that justice would be served. But sadly now, it's been such a long time. My cousin, Colin Smith, was 7 years old. He died of AIDS at the age of 7 years old. which my auntie and uncle had to suffer and watch all that. And the sad thing is here that just justice hasn't been done.
That's so sad. So you're talking about mid-80s there for Colin, is that right?
I was 9 years old, and I think he was 7 when he died. He was very close. He was the only other person in my family that had this. Our mums were twin sisters, so we had this sort of connection. But for me, hepatitis C was kind of hidden from me, Jeremy. So I overheard my mum, as kids do. I was eavesdropping, and I'd watched my cousin die. It was incredibly sad. And for weeks, I actually lived with the fact that my mum had found out I'd had hepatitis C, but hadn't told me straight away. And I knew I was starting to go onto these new injections. And I lived with the fact that I actually thought, for weeks until my mum found me crying, I actually thought that I was going to die as well.
Oh.
And I was sort of, found out that it was actually hepatitis C, but it was very sort of upsetting. Now, a number of years ago, we had letters, big paperwork through from the government sort of saying that we're going to look into it. They made a half-baked attempt at looking into it. Now, back in the 80s, I was on Factor 8, from a very early age, but our product was changing all the time from different manufacturers, from different drugs companies. And we were changing all the time. Now, we got a letter, a number of 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer, saying to my mum and dad, saying, can you remember from May 1986 to June 1986, what product your son was on? They were making a half-baked. Now, obviously, my parents couldn't remember that. The product was chopping and changing all the time. The big thing here was that the hospital should know what they were putting me on at those dates. It's not for my mother and father to remember from 25 years ago.
Thank you, Philip, very much. Sorry, go on.
No problem at all. No, that was it. I mean, I just wanted to say that finally we're hearing that something's going to be done about it. And I'm gobsmacked because it's taken years and years, and we actually thought half the victims that aren't here anymore, that nothing was ever going to happen. So we're grateful for that, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for speaking out, Philip.
No worries. Thanks for that.